COVID-19 public health crisis is evolving into an economic challenge. In its World Economic Outlook yesterday, the IMF stated that what it calls the Great Lockdown will have a much more negative impact than the global financial crisis of over a decade ago and may lead to the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. This underlines the scale of the challenge facing us, but this is a challenge that here in Ireland, with our economy, with decisions that we can make, that we have the ability to help navigate our country through. What we will be doing in the coming weeks is publishing our updated economic forecasts, where the government will lay out our view of the impact of COVID-19 on our economy this year and in 2021 and beyond as part of the Stability Programme update. Forecasts that have already been published show a significant decline in gross domestic product for this year. It is certainly possible that we could see a decline in economic activity within this year that is comparable to or potentially greater than what we experienced a decade ago. So we are in uncharted waters. We're facing a new kind of challenge, facing new economic difficulties. So this is why the response of the government must be commensurate with the challenge that citizens and which our economy now faces. We are now operating in a very different economic environment, and in response to this level of economic challenge, the government has already made a number of very significant interventions. These interventions include work on repayment breaks and business loans, a prohibition on evictions and rent increases, and a deferral of rates for businesses. We've also put in place a package of measures through the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, looking at how we can support the flow of credit throughout our economy as employers change in response to the economic effects of this disease. A key feature of our economic response has been the introduction of the temporary wage subsidy. This is a landmark intervention, and it was introduced to support businesses and to support employees at a time of national emergency. The insight driving this scheme is that if we can protect the income of employees who otherwise would not be in work, it gives us a fighting chance of saving the business for which they work. And supporting businesses and putting in place measures like this, which are in effect the first step of a recovery plan, are now the kinds of measures that we have to implement and keep under review at this time of challenge. So the measures that we are announcing today are intended to build on this support and to build on the work that the scheme has already done. They're designed to support employers and employees during this time of unprecedented difficulty. So the following changes are being made to the scheme. For those employees earning less than €412 per week, which is equivalent to almost €24,400 per year, the subsidy, which was at 70%, will now be increased to 85% of their previous net weekly income. For employees earning between €412 per week and €500 per week, the subsidy will be €350 per week. And stronger employee retention incentives will be put in place, allowing net wages to be topped up by employers beyond 100% of previous net wages up to a maximum of €350 per week, without the subsidy being tapered back. For employees earning in excess of €586 per week, which is equivalent to €38,000 per year, a tiered approach will apply. The maximum subsidy payable for these employees remains €350 per week, and a tiered approach below this takes into account both the amount paid by the employer and the level of reduction in pay borne by the employee. The wage subsidy will now be available to support employees where the pre-COVID salary was greater than €76,000, but their post-COVID salary has fallen below this, subject to the above-mentioned tiered arrangements and tapering. I do acknowledge that for some employers in some parts of our economy, the introduction of measures such as the pandemic unemployment payment have increased challenges for them. It's partly in recognition of this that some of these changes are being made. However, it should also be noted that the PUP may not be claimed if a person chooses to leave employment at this time, but rather when they are laid off. The objective of this scheme is to maintain the link between the employer and the employee. It's to afford the employee the security of a job during and after the crisis, as well as enabling the business to help employers scale back up their business after the scheme has ended. This is a scheme which is, as I said, without precedent in how we are intervening in our economy, and it is a scheme which is designed to lay a big foundation for the ability of employers to scale back up, take people back to work, and keep those people who are still on the payroll for the weeks to come of this difficulty. The figures which the Chairman of the Revenue Commissioner will touch on in a moment do indicate that without an intervention by the state of this scale, we now could have in the region of 1 million citizens either on the live register or accessing the pandemic unemployment payment. Due to the intervention of this scheme, we are currently avoiding this. And as we look to the future of this scheme, it's a scheme which, again, I want to communicate to employers, is designed to encourage the retention of staff on the payroll, but this is also an exceptional scheme. It's a set of exceptional measures. We will not be able to continue these kind of measures indefinitely, but they are in place across this period of the COVID-19 health emergency, and they represent a significant use of the taxpayers' resources. However, we are concentrating them in such a way to protect the most income possible, keep the most number of people in a job, and give a fighting chance to the most number of businesses. And we now have over 40,000 employers on the scheme to give them the best chance possible of a return to employment and a return to growth when we are successful in our efforts against COVID-19. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Minister. The scheme was launched on the 27th of March, and since then we have over 43,500 employers have registered for the scheme. Including today, we've paid out 231 million in wage subsidy, which also includes 20 million in tax refunds to people who have a tax refund through payroll, which is a great simplification for in that they don't have to claim unemployment refunds from ourselves. Up to yesterday, 255,000 employees have benefited from at least one payroll run wage subsidy. So it's a massive result in a very short period of time, and that's down to a lot of work by people in revenue, but also the Payroll Software Development Association, who've been hugely proactive in trying to ensure the system works for their employers. There's just a couple of key messages I'd like to make. As the Minister said, the scheme is to keep employees linked to employers. And one of the provisions provides the opportunity for employers who have temporarily laid off staff to rehire them. And it would be really important if they're going to rehire them to benefit from the scheme, that they do so before the May bank holiday weekend, because the payroll run after that will be based on the full system as the Minister has outlined. So if people could rehire, the system will work seamlessly. They can do it after that, but it's not as integrated. Our website has loads of information, frequently answered questions, and we're constantly updating it as new information comes to light. And obviously the changes announced today in relation to employees who were on over 38,000 to 76,000 and above that will all be on our website today with details of how that works. I suppose the thing that I've also said at various interviews is we still have a small number of employers who don't have the proper refund bank account details, so there's still the figure isn't increasing day by day, but it still stays at about the 2.5 million that is held up because of bank details. So I'd always encourage people to get their bank accounts right, because we want to give out the money as quickly as we can. So that's really it, Minister.
Okay, thank you very much, Niall. And I just want to thank Niall and everybody in the Revenue Commissioner for the amazing work that has been done over the last number of weeks. If it hadn't been for the work the Chairman has done and the work all of his organisation have done, we would not be in a position now where we're actually paying people under this scheme. And within a day of the legislation to enable the scheme being passed by the Oireachtas, employees and employers were receiving money into their bank account. And that would not have been possible if the Chairman of the Revenue Commissioner and his organisation had not stepped up and offered to run this scheme. And I want to thank them for all of the work in that area, because without it, we wouldn't be paying people for many weeks to come.
We will take questions on the wage subsidy scheme first, and then we'll move to Minister Ingrid Miley from RTE. You mentioned there that people who are in employment or on the temporary wage subsidy scheme can't claim the pandemic payment, and also that you can't claim the pandemic payment if you leave work. But the government has set up a system for the pandemic payment whereby, unlike job seekers, you don't have to have a proof that you have been laid off. And there have been anecdotal reports of people walking out of jobs in order to, particularly low-paid jobs or part-time jobs, in order to avail of this. Was it a flaw in the design of the pandemic payment structure that you didn't keep a validation process that you have for job seekers, where you have to show that you've been laid off? The second thing is that a statement went out from the Revenue Commissioners saying that 80% of employers are topping up. By how much are they topping up, and how do you know what the situation is there? And thirdly, what retrospection is there? I mean, like, if you've been on the scheme and the employer applies late, is there retrospection, or how does that work? Thank you.
Well, I might deal with the first question, and I maybe ask the Chairman to deal with the other two. In relation to your first question about the design of the pandemic unemployment payment, the issue that we faced, Ingrid, across the number of days in the immediate aftermath of the public health guidance being changed as a result of COVID-19 is how we could support the income of many hundreds of thousands of people who had very, very suddenly lost a job. And it became apparent to us very quickly that if we tried to process that through our normal job seeker payment systems, we wouldn't have the ability to process that number of cases with the speed with which these citizens needed the income. And that is the reason why a new payment was brought in. You are correct to say that because we brought in a new payment, the kind of verification methods that we would have for other forms of social welfare. It was not possible to get them in place. But if we had waited to get them in place, two things would have happened. The first one is that it would have taken some time to process any income to those citizens who had lost their jobs. And bear in mind, we're talking about many hundreds of thousands of people who had lost their job. And secondly, we would have ended up paying them the very basic level of a job seeker payment that would, in all likelihood, have been considerably below the total amount of social welfare payments they would have been able to access in a few weeks or a few months' time if we had been able to process their application. So in order to get income to people quickly, we decided to introduce this payment, and a feature of it was that it didn't have some of the verification that other payments do have, but it had the great merit of being able to get income to lots of people quickly, in the absence of which hundreds of thousands of previous taxpayers would have seen their income go from what they were getting in work to just over €200 in a week, with the possibility of that €200 not being paid for a number of weeks.
In relation to the top-ups, as you're aware, the system works based on payroll run. So the employer files their payroll run with ourselves, operates tax on the payment that they make, and we push out the wage subsidy. So we have the details of the employer payroll submitted to us for all these, anybody in the scheme availing of the system. I think you're probably aware that last Thursday we published our first suite of statistics on the wage subsidy scheme, and what we'll do is that every week we'll update that. In the next publication, we're going to give a breakdown of income ranges and levels of top-up by amounts, 0 to 100, 100 to 200. We're working on that, and it'll be in our this week's publication. So we're going to, as you know, we did it with various other schemes. We keep adding to our suite of information, and I know that you're a regular requester for our statistics on the scheme. So I think you're on the list for a special send out of the publication when we have it ready. And the piece about the retrospection, the system works. The driver of the scheme is the employer. So the employer has to register. And once the employer register, they're eligible for the scheme on payroll runs after registration. So you can't register now and say, I want to be in the scheme since the 27th of March. So it's all driven by essentially the weekly payroll run by the employer, linked back to people who were on the payroll on the 29th of February, which is absolutely a critical condition for the scheme to work.
Any other questions?
Minister, you said a couple of occasions that the state can't afford to do this indefinitely. Where is the definite cut-off point? How long could the state conceivably sustain these sort of numbers?
Well, we have the ability to sustain the wage subsidy scheme for the full 12-week period since the scheme was implemented. We are monitoring each week how many are accessing it. It's not possible at this point to put down a very specific end date beyond this, because so much of what we'll have to deal with does depend on where we're going to be with COVID-19. But what I'll simply say is that for schemes like the wage subsidy scheme, for some who would argue that it is possible to sustain something like this indefinitely, and in particular when our country moves beyond this phase of COVID-19, we will not be able to do that. This is a scheme that will have the ability to cost many hundreds of millions of euros per week. And at a point in time when we are successful from emerging from the worst of COVID-19, and when employers are getting back on their own 2 feet, when they're employing employees directly themselves, we will then be looking at ways in which we can ensure the taxpayer plays less of a role in doing that, because the resources of taxpayers will be needed for other things at that point. So we can sustain this scheme for now, but when we get to a point of seeing our public health improve and seeing, as a result of that, our economy improve, the wage subsidy scheme and the way in which it operates will be reviewed and then tapered.
And with regards to lockdown, obviously there's a lot of discussion about possibly ease a lockdown. Is it possible, in your view, to get certain types of workers back to work quicker than others? So let's say, for example, in 3 or 4 weeks' time, if the health numbers stack up, you can see builders and brickies back at work before public classes.
Well, when we went into this public health guidance, we did go into it in a graduated way. We went into it with different guidance being offered to different parts of our economy at different points in time. So therefore it is possible to imagine an exit from that that's similar to the way we went in. But we are quite a bit away from that at the moment. Where we are at the moment, as you all know, is on Friday the Taoiseach indicated to the country that the current public health guidance that we have in place is now going to last until early May. And for those who are thinking about what an exit strategy should look like, for those who are calling for a return to normal or a return to a different kind of work to where we are now, I'd simply say to them that the best chance that we have of exiting from where we are at the moment depends on people implementing the guidance which the government is currently offering in relation to social distancing and in relation to our own physical health and hygiene. The better implemented that is, the more we continue to make progress on that, the better chance we have of not only having a debate regarding what Ireland will look like when we exit this current phase, but getting to that point. But for now, that is not the focus of our efforts. The focus of our efforts is in implementing the guidance that we have as it stands today.
Casey and Christina. I know we spoke last week about this subsidy not being subject to tax, well, not being taxed at the moment, but being subject to tax, and the anxiety that people are feeling about the fact they will face a tax liability at the end of this. Is there any kind of advice the government is offering for people that are in that situation, that are kind of nervous about the fact that they don't know how much they're going to owe when this ends?
Just to reassure to them again that the commitment that we have is that those taxpayers, from a net point of view, will neither be no worse off nor no better off than they would have been on if they hadn't been on the scheme. So we want to ensure that when the scheme comes to an end, anybody who's on it neither pays any more or any less tax than they would have paid. Yes, we will look at the end of the year to see if any taxable liability is there. We do have to do it, because we do have to ensure that we're fair to workers who are not on the scheme but may have seen their wages cut, and we do have to be fair to others who are receiving social welfare payments where those social welfare payments are actually taxed. So for those reasons of fairness, we do have to have a look at the end of the year to see where we stand, if any new tax liabilities have been generated. And as I said last week, the Revenue Commissioner and the Chairman may come in at that point, will then look at the fairest way in which tax like that, if it exists, could actually be collected.
I think that we generally deal with underpayments for POI workers through, we code in the underpayment, and we collect it over the next year or longer. But I think if we took an example of somebody, a single person who's on 31,000 gross a year, who's in receipt of the wage subsidy for the 12 weeks at 350, they would have an additional liability of €120 for the year. And if we collected that in 2021 over the weekly basis, it would be an additional liability of €2.32 over the year. Now, what often happens with people who have an underpayment under POE, they actually prefer to pay it. Strangely enough, some people prefer to pay tax in one go and get it off the system. But we're well used to dealing with relatively small underpayments through the POE system, through the coding system. Also, they will potentially have tax credits to set off against it if you had a health expense in the period. So I think that there's a lot of people creating problems around the scheme, and everybody will have big tax liabilities. The type of monies involved generally won't lead to big tax liabilities at the end of the year, and we're always open to dealing with those in a practical and pragmatic way.
Just on the issue of tax, obviously people will want to ensure that they can get their tax back, or they're working at home and there might be tax things they can apply for. Is the revenue giving any sort of guidance for people who might perhaps be owed tax, might need that extra money at hand now to get in touch with you guys and to apply for those additional tax breaks that might be relevant to them working at home? And then just separately on the issue of expenses, I think there was a story in the Examiner today about TDs who are also looking for possible money for working at home, and the same sort of issue. Just a response from the Minister on that.
As regards people entitled to refunds of tax, we have, over the last 6 weeks, we have cleared so many tax refunds in the system, because one of the things that we're continuing to do is that while we mostly are not working in our offices, everybody is working. There's over 5,000 revenue staff connected right now, processing refunds, processing repayments, and that's ongoing. And you will see from our website as well, we've issued a number of clarifications on the tax treatment in the emergency, and one of them is a kind of a little known tax credit that's available for people working at home, which we updated the guidance on. And there's a daily allowance that's claimable, and that's available. But obviously, with every tax allowance, it requires expenditure. It's not just a free allowance for working at home. You have to have expenditure, and those claims are there. But we are very conscious of both the cash flow effect on business, and if you look at the March Exchequer returns, I think the highest level of VAT repayments were paid out in March ever, as a result of us concentrating on getting repayments out. So for businesses, we're working on ensuring repayments are dealt with as speedily as possible. And for private POA workers, we have the lowest level of unworked and unprocessed correspondence that we ever had. And if there's any individual issues, that's what we want to keep doing with our guidance, is constantly responding to issues that come to light as quickly as we can.
And Christine, in relation to your question there about additional expenses for members of the Oireachtas from working from home, I believe the House of the Oireachtas Commission have issued a statement on this matter, saying they're not planning to bring in any new expense systems to pay additional money to allow that to happen. That is a statement from them that I support. I'd make the point that now, for many years, the Houses of the Oireachtas have been making laptops and mobile phones available to those who are in the Dáil or the Seanad to allow them to work in different places. And that is the way that equipment should be used now.
Minister, and maybe to the Chairman as well, a number of companies have expressed some difficulty that if they're trying to keep their employees on their full salaries, that they're encouraging or they're encountering difficulties. Is there a priority to try and keep as many people in work, or are you trying to keep as many people at their full salary levels in terms of what the system is trying to propose? And further to Christine's question, Minister, there have been calls this morning on foot of our story about the announcement that the opposite should happen, that TD should take pay cuts. Have you a view as to whether or not such things are on the horizon?
So in relation to the first question, my experience from dealing with this issue is that any company who has experienced the level of turnover decline, that means they're considering entering this scheme, has already implemented or is considering implementing wage reductions for their employees anyway. So because we do have a requirement of the scheme that their turnover has to have gone down by a certain amount, I can't imagine many circumstances in which a company would therefore be on the scheme and in which they haven't looked at reducing wages for at least some staff. In terms of the purpose of this scheme, the purpose of this scheme is to try to maintain as much income as we can for those who are on it. But it is not a commitment to maintain all income for those on it. And the reason for that is if we were to give such a commitment, it wouldn't be possible to have a scheme of this breadth. And that is why the subsidy is up to 85% for people just earning over €24,000, and then it's 70% beyond that. And we have a number of criteria built in which that subsidy can be tapered further depending on the kind of contribution that an employer is able to make. In relation to your question about further reductions in TD salaries, that is not something to date which has been considered. Those of us who are members of government now for quite a while have not been participants in the wage increases that have been made available as part of the FEMPI legislation for ministers. So that has been in place for all members of this government now since it came into office. And I haven't to date considered whether wage reductions are merited or needed for TDs or senators. It is the case that a number of TDs and senators are handing back to the state increases in which they were due, but it's also the case that some others are not doing that. Do you want to come in on what I said?
Kind of the piece around whether it allows people to continue to pay 100%. The system is structured and built to cater for as wide a people as possible. And I've seen some of that commentary about we can't get it to actually get exactly the same as what we paid before. And it couldn't be designed for that. I said it, I think, to the Minister earlier. People have kind of complained that it doesn't exactly fit our payroll system. And if it was, we'd have to design a system that would be compatible with 181,000 employers, which would take about 3 years and probably couldn't be done, as opposed to a system that was essentially designed in a week. So there is an interaction between gross pay and a net wage subsidy, which is confusing certain practitioners. But I think they're looking for a perfect solution for their individual circumstances than one that can work for everybody.
Just to follow up on Christine and Dan's questions, the Prime Minister of New Zealand has announced that she and her cabinet will take 20% pay cuts for 6 months. Is that something that should happen here? They've done it out of solidarity with people who have suffered income losses due to coronavirus. And in relation to government formation, the framework document is out now. 2 things I'm wondering about that. In the Green New Deal, there is a proposal that there would be more ambitious cuts in carbon emissions. The Green Party wants 7%. Could those cuts be 7% per year? And in terms of regional balance, a lot of the independents who might consider joining government are looking for regional balance in terms of investment over coming years. And we know that most of the jobs lost in coronavirus crisis have been outside of Dublin. So can you offer a commitment that there will be a focus on creating employment in the regions in the next government?
So there will absolutely be an even higher level of focus on how we can restore jobs back to communities that have lost them. It was a feature of this government that we were successful in seeing the majority of jobs in some sectors of our economy being created outside of Dublin. And it will be the case for any new government that is formed that we will have to look at how we can try and put jobs back into those communities that lost those jobs in the first place. And that is why in the paper that was made available at 2 o'clock, it makes a renewed commitment to the need for strengthened regional employment because we accept that the loss of jobs is uneven, and we accept that some parts of our countries are feeling that loss of jobs the most. And I'd expect that any government that is formed, particularly one if it includes my own party, will have a very strong focus on that. In relation to your question, Cormac, about the Green New Deal and the possibility of a strengthened commitment to how we will reduce our annual emissions targets. My own party is certainly open to how we can look at how that can be done. What we believe is critical, though, is clarity regarding how that can be achieved. And I believe that given the challenge that is still there with climate change, if any government was to commit to a higher path of emissions reductions, there would have to be agreement within that government regarding how that could happen, how it could be achieved, and how it could be funded. And if we do end up engaging with other political parties on a formation of a government, if clarity is to be brought regarding a higher level of emissions targets and a more ambitious target for that, equal honesty and clarity has to be brought to how that would be achieved, and how that would be achieved in a way that would be both, economically and socially sustainable for Ireland. In terms of the case for further reductions, or reductions, I should say, in wages for those of us who are office holders. As a government, we haven't had any discussion on that issue so far, we will look at what other governments are doing. As I said to Daniel a moment ago, it is the case that the wage increases of recent years have not applied to office holders, but I absolutely understand now that many people all over the country are facing a very severe loss in income that they're having to deal with. And I'm sure the government will, discuss this and other matters in the coming weeks.
Is it the case then with the 7% a year that you're not ruling it out, but you'd like to bring rights how they will bring that about?
Yeah, if it's stated kind of slightly differently, we went into the general election earlier on this year with a commitment to reducing our emissions by a certain amount. And in the climate action plan that we published there, which was put in place by Richard Bruton, we explained step by step how we would do it. And crucially, we explained what would be the commitment that different parts of our economy would have to reducing that target. And if it is the case that any new government wants to commit to a higher emissions reduction figure, we then have to revise that action plan and make clear how we are going to do it. So I think the text of the document that's been published today, that I'm sure you've seen, indicates that we will want to look at how we could go further, but we'll only commit to going further if we're absolutely clear how that can happen, and if we're clear that can happen in a way that is affordable for our economy and socially sustainable. And I am sure in any engagement that we will have with any other political party, if they want a new government to go further, they will want to be clear regarding how that would happen. You all?